What the Yakuza street soldiers didn't know when they cornered the elderly janitor at Sakura Mall was that the old man quietly mopping floors had once been Shadow 6, the deadliest sniper in Marine Corps history, with 300 confirmed kills in Vietnam alone. Now, as their mocking laughter echoed through the empty food court, Thomas Ghost Walker Chen's weathered hands instinctively remembered every inch of the disassembled Mark 11 rifle hidden in his cleaning car. Sunset Mall's polished floors reflected fluorescent lights as James Walker methodically pushed his mop in precise, overlapping patterns. At 67, his weathered hands gripped the wooden handle with the same measured control he'd once used on his M40A1 rifle in the jungles of Vietnam. Most shoppers passed the elderly janitor without a second glance, seeing only gray hair, stooped shoulders, and a worn maintenance uniform. None noticed how his pale blue eyes continuously scanned his surroundings, cataloging faces, movements, and patterns with military precision. Evening, Mr. Walker, Sarah Chen called from her small jewelry kiosk. The young woman's smile carried an edge of worry that caught James's attention immediately. His practiced gaze noted her tension, the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged displays. 3 weeks ago, she'd started jumping at sudden noises, keeping shorter hours. Classic signs of intimidation. "Everything all right, Sarah?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle, maintaining his carefully crafted image of a kindly old maintenance man. His mop never stopped moving, each stroke cleaning exactly 36 inches of floor space, just as it had for the past 5 years. "Yes, just tired," she replied, glancing nervously toward the east entrance. James followed her gaze, noting 3 young men in expensive suits entering the mall. Their casual swagger carried the unmistakable arrogance of predators marking territory. Japanese tattoos peeked from beneath designer cuffs, Yakuza, mid-level soldiers expanding their protection racket into new territory. James adjusted his cleaning pattern, ensuring his route would intersect with their path while appearing completely random. The mall's security cameras had blind spots. He mapped them all within his first week of employment. As he worked, his mind automatically calculated distances, angles, potential choke points. Old habits from long-range reconnaissance never really died. Maintenance, he muttered apologetically, shuffling between shoppers with practiced invisibility. The 3 Yakuza members barely glanced at him, just another service worker beneath their notice. But James cataloged everything: their weapons, shoulder holsters, poor concealment; their formation, leaders slightly ahead, 2 flanking; their tactical awareness, minimal, overconfident. Through streaked windows, he watched the sun setting over the city. Reduced visibility would change tactical considerations. Night brought different threats, different opportunities. He'd learned that lesson in the Aishao Valley, where darkness transformed jungle into both cover and killing ground. His radio crackled. "Walker, cleanup needed at the food court." Mark Reynolds, the mall's head of security, trying to sound casual while using their prearranged signal. James acknowledged with a tired sigh that masked his immediate tactical assessment. The food court offered clear lines of sight to all main entrances, multiple evacuation routes, and excellent acoustic properties for monitoring conversations. As he pushed his cleaning cart toward the call, James noted more signs of the Yakuza's growing presence. The Chinese restaurant's owner watched the suited men with barely concealed fear. The sports store's new security gates had been hastily installed. The camera store's previous owner had retired, suddenly last week. "Sorry about the mess," Mark muttered as James arrived, both men pretending to focus on a spilled soda while observing the Yakuza members settling at a corner table. Perfect position for intimidating businesses while watching customer traffic. They were establishing presence, marking territory before beginning serious extortion. "No problem," James replied, voice carrying the weary resignation expected of a man his age doing menial work. His hands shook slightly as he cleaned, a carefully maintained trait that made people dismiss him as harmless. None would guess those same hands had once maintained a 96% accuracy rate at ranges beyond 800 meters. Sarah wasn't the only one watching the Yakuza with fear. Other shop owners tried to appear busy while stealing nervous glances. The gang's reputation had preceded them, protection money demanded, inventory purchased at ridiculous discounts, businesses that refused burning in suspicious accidents. James finished cleaning the spill, each movement measured and inefficient looking while actually positioning him for optimal observation. The mall's regular security was good at handling shoplifters and rowdy teenagers, but they were completely unprepared for organized crime. He'd watched Mark's growing frustration as police responses became increasingly delayed and ineffective. The Yakuza leader laughed suddenly, the sound echoing off food court tiles. Several shop owners flinched. James kept mopping, maintaining his facade of elderly indifference. But behind that careful mask, other instincts stirred. The same instincts that had once earned him the nickname Ghost among Marine Scout snipers. His particular set of skills hadn't been needed since Vietnam. He'd chosen this quiet life deliberately, finding peace in simple maintenance work. But watching Sarah's hands tremble as she closed her kiosk early, seeing the fear in eyes of people he'd silently protected for years, James felt old muscles tensing with familiar readiness. The Yakuza members stood, straightening expensive jackets. As they passed James, one deliberately kicked his mop bucket, splashing dirty water across freshly cleaned floors. They laughed, expecting the old janitor to hunch further, to absorb the humiliation with aged resignation. James did exactly that, muttering apologies as he cleaned the new mess. But his pale eyes tracked their departure with sniper's precision, cataloging movement patterns, tactical weaknesses, behavioral indicators. They saw a harmless old man. They hadn't yet learned that the most dangerous predators were often the ones that seemed least threatening. Night settled over Sunset Mall as James finished his shift, carefully storing his cleaning supplies in designated closets. Each piece of equipment had its place, maintained with military precision, just as his old rifle had been back when precision meant survival and a single shot could change the course of battles. He wasn't that man anymore. But watching the fear spread through his mall, remembering Sarah's trembling hands, James Walker knew changes were coming. The Yakuza thought they were marking new territory. They didn't realize they'd wandered into the hunting grounds of a predator far deadlier than themselves. The echo of Yakuza laughter in Sunset Mall's corridors faded into older, darker memories as James Walker drove home that night. His small apartment above Harry's hardware store wasn't much, but it offered clear lines of sight to three major intersections. Old habits, always maintaining tactical advantage. In his sparse living room, James's eyes fell on the locked footlocker tucked beneath a weathered desk. He hadn't opened it in years, but his fingers still knew the combination by heart. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the worn leather of his old shooting journal. The pages carried more than statistics and calculations. They held the story of a different man, one the mall's shoppers would never recognize. A Shao Valley, 1969. The jungle's breath had been heavy with morning mist as James lay motionless in his hand-built hide. 72 hours without moving more than his trigger finger, letting mud and leaves cake his skin while NVA patrols passed within feet of his position. His spotter, Danny Eyes Rodriguez, had maintained radio silence, both men communicating through hand signals perfected over countless missions. The memory was so vivid he could still feel the M40A1's familiar weight. Their target, a high-ranking NVA officer, was expected to inspect forward positions that morning. Intelligence had been solid. James and Danny had spent weeks tracking the officer's patterns, gathering data, calculating every variable that could affect a shot at extreme range. James's weathered hands flexed, remembering the precise pressure needed on the trigger. 847 meters. Humidity at 82%. Wind varying between 8 and 12 knots. Elevation differential requiring a precise holdover. Variables that had become instinct through years of training and combat experience. The shot, when it came, had changed the entire northern offensive. One round, one kill, mission accomplished. But it wasn't that shot that had earned him the nickname Ghost. It was the 12 days that followed, evading NVA hunter-killer teams through mountainous jungle, carrying Danny despite a shrapnel wound that had shattered his friend's leg. James stood, moving to his window with the same silence that had kept him alive in Vietnam. Below, Saturday night traffic moved through familiar patterns. His tactical mind automatically noted changes, new vehicles, altered routines, potential surveillance positions. The Yakuza would be expanding their presence, gathering intelligence on businesses before beginning serious extortion. Another memory surfaced. Hughes City, 1970. Urban combat required different skills than jungle warfare. Buildings became both cover and killing ground. Civilians complicated every tactical decision. James had adapted, learning to use urban terrain to his advantage. Skills that might become relevant again if the Yakuza continued pushing into his territory. His phone buzzed. Mark Reynolds, the mall's head of security. Just got word. Mark's voice was tight with concern. 2 shops in the Diamond District got hit tonight. Accidents. Same pattern as the others. James acknowledged quietly, his mind already calculating. The Diamond District was 3 blocks from Sunset Mall. The Yakuza were moving systematically, establishing control through carefully escalating violence. Just like the NVA had done in Vietnamese villages, breaking resistance through fear before establishing permanent control. Police response? James asked, though he already knew the answer. Delayed. Evidence inconclusive. Same story as the others. Mark's frustration was evident. I've got family shopping in this mall, James. Sarah Chen's got a baby on the way. These people trust us to protect them. Trust. James remembered another conversation about trust, deep in the jungle, with Danny bleeding beside him. Ghost, Danny had whispered through pain, "You got us into this mess. Trust you to get us out." James had gotten him out, carrying his friend through enemy territory for 12 days straight. They'd said it couldn't be done. But people were always saying things couldn't be done, right up until someone did them. His eyes fell on the shooting journal, its pages containing more than just kill confirmations and range calculations. There were other lessons learned in blood and darkness. Lessons about patience, about waiting for the perfect shot, about the responsibility that came with the power to end lives from distances other snipers called impossible. The mall's cleaning supplies weren't the only things James maintained with military precision. In his bedroom closet, behind carefully arranged work uniforms, a hidden panel concealed his personal range kit. Distance finder, wind meter, plotting tools, all maintained perfectly, though unused for decades. He hadn't fired a rifle since Vietnam, but his hands still knew every movement, every calculation, every subtle adjustment needed for precision shooting. Sarah Chen's fearful eyes flashed in his memory, overlapping with the faces of Vietnamese villagers who'd lived under similar fear. He'd been younger then, full of righteous anger at those who preyed on the vulnerable. Age had tempered that anger into something colder, more precise. Like adjusting a scope for windage and elevation, every movement calculated for maximum effect. James moved to his desk, drawing out blank paper. His hands, which had shaken believably while mopping floors, now moved with rock-steady precision as he began sketching Sunset Mall's layout. Entry points, sight lines, potential firing positions, civilian evacuation routes, all the elements needed for urban combat operations. The Yakuza saw an old janitor, harmless and beneath their notice. They hadn't learned what the NVA had discovered too late, that underestimating an opponent was often fatal. In Vietnam, they'd called him Ghost because he could eliminate high-value targets without ever being seen, disappearing into terrain like a shadow. As night settled over the city, James Walker began preparing for a different kind of war. Not in jungle valleys or city ruins, but in the polished corridors of a suburban mall. The Yakuza were about to learn what the NVA had learned in a Shao Valley, that the deadliest predator was often the one you never saw coming. Monday morning brought new changes to Sunset Mall. James noticed them immediately as he began his pre-opening cleaning routine. 3 more shops had installed security gates overnight. The Chinese restaurant's windows now displayed a small red origami crane, a sign of protection payment accepted. More concerning was the fresh paint covering Sarah Chen's jewelry kiosk sign, marking a business that had refused. James maintained his methodical cleaning pattern while his sniper's eye cataloged every detail. 2 new security cameras had appeared, their angles suggesting Yakuza surveillance rather than mall security. Their installation would have required after-hours access, meaning they'd already corrupted some of the night's staff. "Morning, Mr. Walker." Mark Reynolds approached, coffee cup providing cover for their conversation. The head of security looked like he hadn't slept. Had some inventory go missing from Electronics World last night. Security footage is mysteriously corrupted. James nodded slightly, adjusting his mop to maintain the appearance of work while scanning the growing morning crowd. "They're establishing patterns," he murmured, voice barely audible over the wet slap of his mop. "Testing response times, identifying weak points in security. Standard infiltration tactics." Through the skylight windows, early sunlight cast long shadows across the mall's polished floors. James had spent decades learning to read shadows, both in jungle canopy and urban terrain. These shadows showed him everything: the new lookout posted near the north entrance, the subtle changes in shop owners' movements as they opened for business, the calculated positioning of apparent shoppers who were actually Yakuza soldiers. "They're moving faster than expected," Mark whispered, pretending to check his phone. 2 more businesses hid in the Diamond District last night. Fire departments calling it electrical problems. James recognized the escalation pattern. He'd seen similar tactics in Vietnam, gradual pressure building to create an atmosphere of helplessness before the real violence began. His trained eye spotted 4 more Yakuza members entering through the east doors, their expensive suits and confident stride marking them as higher ranking than yesterday's visitors. "They're establishing a hierarchy," he explained quietly, years of tactical observation flowing into his analysis. "Street soldiers for intimidation, mid-level managers for collection, leadership for oversight, creating a complete operational structure." Sarah Chen arrived to open her kiosk, her hand shaking as she saw the vandalized sign. James adjusted his cleaning route to pass nearby, noting how 2 Yakuza soldiers immediately began drifting in her direction. His fingers tightened imperceptibly on the mop handle, muscle memory from countless missions automatically calculating firing solutions, even without a rifle. "Mr. Walker," Sarah called out, voice trembling slightly. "Could you help me clean this paint?" It was a natural request for a janitor. It also gave James legitimate reason to position himself between Sarah and the approaching Yakuza. He could feel their irritation at the interruption of their intimidation routine. They wouldn't confront him directly, not yet. He was too public, too visible. But he just put himself on their radar. "Happy to help, Miss Chen," he replied, maintaining his elderly shuffle as he retrieved cleaning supplies from his cart. Each movement was carefully calculated to appear random, while actually providing optimal observation angles. The Yakuza soldiers retreated slightly, speaking rapid Japanese into concealed phones. "They were here last night," Sarah whispered, pretending to direct his cleaning. "Offered protection. Said accidents happen to pregnant women who don't understand business." Her hand drifted protectively to her slightly swollen belly. James felt that cold focus settling over him, the same stillness that had once let him lay motionless for days while tracking high-value targets. His practiced eye had already identified 12 potential sniper positions overlooking the mall's main concourse. The Yakuza's tactical awareness was poor. They'd chosen obvious observation posts while ignoring superior positions. More customers began filtering in, but James's trained senses easily distinguished civilian shoppers from Yakuza surveillance. Their movement patterns were too precise, their positioning too tactical. He counted 8 members now visible, suggesting a much larger organization preparing to claim territory. Mark passed by again, this time carrying maintenance forms. "Police just announced budget cuts," he muttered. Response times to this district will be temporarily reduced. James understood immediately. The Yakuza had corrupted or intimidated key officials, ensuring limited law enforcement interference. It was a sophisticated operation, suggesting their organization was larger and more entrenched than initial intelligence suggested. As he finished cleaning the paint from Sarah's sign, James observed 3 more shop owners being approached by Yakuza soldiers. The protection racket was accelerating, moving from subtle pressure to direct threats. Soon, the violence would begin, carefully targeted incidents to demonstrate the cost of resistance. His tactical mind was already processing variables, calculating fields of fire, identifying choke points and evacuation routes. The mall's architecture offered both challenges and opportunities for urban combat operations. But civilian presence complicated every scenario, just as it had in Vietnam. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," Sarah said as he completed the cleaning. Her eyes carried that same fearful gratitude he'd seen in Vietnamese villages, people caught between violent forces, looking for any sign of protection. James nodded gently, maintaining his cover as he pushed his cleaning cart toward the next location. The Yakuza were creating an atmosphere of inevitable victory, making businesses believe resistance was futile. They didn't realize they'd wandered into the sights of someone who specialized in making the impossible possible. Through the mall's windows, morning sunlight continued painting shadows across polished floors. James Walker had spent a lifetime learning to read shadows, to become one with them, to strike from them with lethal precision. The Yakuza were about to learn what the NVA had discovered in Ashao Valley, that shadows could hide more than darkness, and death often came from the direction you least expected. The sound of breaking glass shattered the usual morning quiet of Sunset Mall. James Walker's mop stopped mid-stroke, his trained ear instantly identifying the location, Sarah Chen's jewelry kiosk. The crash carried the deliberate sound of demonstration, not accident. 5 minutes ahead of his calculated timeline, the Yakuza were getting impatient. 2 suited figures stood at Sarah's kiosk, their stances carrying practiced intimidation. A third man, the leader James had cataloged earlier, examined a broken display case with exaggerated concern. Sarah's face was pale, one hand protectively over her pregnant belly, as the leader spoke in measured tones about unfortunate accidents and protection services. James adjusted his cleaning route, maintaining his carefully crafted appearance of aged inefficiency while positioning himself within optimal range. His veteran's ears caught fragments of conversation, protection fees, payment schedules, consequences of refusal. Standard extortion pattern, but executed with professional precision that confirmed his earlier assessment of their organization level. "Everything all right here?" James shuffled forward, voice carrying the timid uncertainty expected from elderly maintenance staff. His stooped posture and trembling hands projected vulnerability, while his mind calculated exact distances and angles. 3 targets, 2 armed, civilian presence requiring precise response options. The Yakuza leader, Tanaka, James had learned through careful observation, turned with practiced smoothness. His smile carried perfectly calibrated condescension. "Nothing to concern yourself with, old man. Just discussing business with the lady." Sarah's eyes met James's briefly, carrying desperate appeal. The broken display case had contained her most valuable pieces, representing months of work. Behind Tanaka, his subordinates maintained tactical positioning that betrayed military training. Not special forces level, but professional enough to warrant caution. "Awful mess here," James mumbled, moving forward with his mop. "Should clean this up before someone gets hurt." His seemingly random movement actually placed him in perfect position to control the engagement zone. In Vietnam, positioning had often meant the difference between success and mission failure. "I said," Tanaka's voice hardened. "This doesn't concern you." He moved to block James's advance, hand sliding subtly toward his concealed shoulder holster. "Amateur tell." telegraphing intent through unconscious movement. James had eliminated harder targets in Hugh City without ever revealing his presence. "Just doing my job," James's voice carried slight quaver. His shaking hands on a mop handle perfectly concealed the combat-steady precision of his tactical assessment. 3 seconds to neutralize the immediate threat. 5 seconds for his subordinates to react. 8 seconds before mall security could respond. Tanaka's hand shot out, shoving James backward. The move was calculated to demonstrate power while maintaining plausible deniability, professional enforcer's technique. But he didn't understand that he'd just given James perfect justification for what came next. James allowed himself to stumble, using the momentum to position his center of gravity optimally. The mop handle moved with sniper's precision, its tip finding the exact point between Tanaka's ribs that would disable without causing permanent damage. A technique learned in close-quarters combat training, adapted for his current cover identity. Tanaka's breath exploded outward as he doubled over. His subordinates moved forward, but James was already shuffling away, mumbling apologies about losing his balance. To casual observers, it appeared the elderly janitor had simply tripped, accidentally striking the well-dressed businessman with his mop handle during the fall. So sorry, James maintained his frightened elder act, but his eyes caught every detail. Tanaka's subordinates helping their leader up, their faces showing confusion over how a seemingly harmless old man had managed such a precisely debilitating strike. Sarah watching with dawning hope as her tormentors retreated, trying to maintain dignity. "This isn't finished," Tanaka managed through clenched teeth, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. For the first time, he looked at James with real attention, trying to reconcile the trembling janitor with the precision of that strike. "Accidents happen," James replied mildly, returning to his mopping. But he allowed just enough edge to enter his voice, just enough stillness to enter his posture, that Tanaka's combat experience would register subconscious warning signals. Like adjusting a scope by fractions of an inch, it was about precise calibration of effect. Mall security arrived moments later, Mark Reynolds leading the response. His quick eyes took in the scene, broken display case, shaken Sarah, Tanaka's controlled but obvious discomfort. "Everything all right here?" "Just a misunderstanding," Tanaka smiled tightly. "We were leaving." His subordinates maintained professional composure, but their formation had shifted subtly. They were now treating the elderly janitor as a potential threat, though their conscious minds hadn't yet processed why. As they departed, James continued his methodical cleaning, apparently focused solely on removing any trace of broken glass. But his sniper's attention cataloged every detail of their retreat, Tanaka's slightly favored side, his subordinates' heightened alertness, the way they maintained greater distance from the seemingly harmless maintenance man. "You okay?" Mark asked quietly, pitching his voice for James's ears alone. "Fine." James kept his focus on the floor, but his mind was already calculating. The Yakuza would escalate after this. Their reputation required it. But they would be more cautious now, uncertain about the old janitor who had somehow landed a perfectly disabling strike while appearing to stumble. Sarah approached hesitantly, her eyes showing mixture of gratitude and concern. "Mr. Walker, I'm so sorry they involved you in this." "Nothing to worry about," James reassured her, maintaining his grandfatherly demeanor. But his tactical mind was already gaming out scenarios, planning countermeasures for the inevitable response. The Yakuza would be watching him now, trying to determine if that precise strike had been luck or something more. Let them watch, he thought, carefully cleaning the last traces of broken glass. They would see exactly what he wanted them to see, a harmless old janitor who had gotten lucky during a fall. But beneath that carefully maintained facade, other plans were forming. Like setting up a sniper's hide, it was all about patience and precise preparation. The Yakuza had just learned that Sunset Mall might not be as defenseless as they'd assumed. Soon they would learn what the NVA had discovered in a Shao Valley, that underestimating an opponent's capabilities was often the last mistake you ever made. Sunset Mall's early morning silence shattered as the sports store's front window exploded inward. James Walker watched from his customary cleaning position as glass shards scattered across his freshly mopped floors. The Yakuza's message was clear. Mr. Chen had refused their protection offer yesterday. Now his store would serve as an example to others. Through the settling dust, James noted 4 new Yakuza members he hadn't seen before. Their movements showed military training, not U.S. forces, probably private security backgrounds. The gang was escalating, bringing in professionals to supplement their street soldiers. Just as the NVA had done when simple intimidation failed to break village resistance. Maintenance, James mumbled, shuffling forward with his broom. His stooped posture concealed the fact that he was marking distances, cataloging weapons, analyzing tactical positions. The Yakuza's new muscle carried themselves differently, Israeli-trained, based on their movement patterns. Close protection specialists who'd found better money working for criminals. "Stay back, old man," one of them warned, his accent confirming James's assessment. "Accident scene. Dangerous glass." James kept sweeping, his trembling hands selling the image of elderly weakness while his sniper's mind calculated firing solutions. The Israeli's position by the escalator, 43 meters, elevation differential requiring 0.3 mil adjustment. His partner's stance betrayed a right-side weapon draw. Useful information, carefully filed away. Mark Reynolds arrived with mall security, going through the motions of reporting and photographing damage everyone knew would lead nowhere. But James spotted the subtle hand signal, 3 fingers pressed against thigh. Message received. The security chief had found the surveillance photos James had left in his office, showing Yakuza members conducting late-night weapons transfers behind the mall. 4th incident this week, Mark announced loudly, playing his role. "We'll need better camera coverage in this sector." James nodded vaguely, maintaining his cover while noting how the Israeli contractors reacted to the mention of cameras. Professional paranoia. They'd start checking surveillance systems, which would lead them to the dummy cameras James had installed last week. The real observation posts were elsewhere, positioned using lessons learned from urban combat in Hugh City. Sarah Chen approached cautiously, her pregnancy now visible beneath loose clothing. "My father's store," she said quietly, watching glass being swept away. "They're trying to force him to sell." James's hands tightened imperceptibly on his broom handle. In Vietnam, he'd seen how insurgents targeted family connections, using loved ones as pressure points. The Yakuza were following the same playbook, escalating pressure on those who resisted. Through grimy windows, morning sunlight cast long shadows across the mall's eastern entrance. James's tactical assessment noted new security cameras installed by the gang, their fields of fire creating interlocking coverage. Professional work. But professionals often missed what they consider beneath their notice, like maintenance access panels and ventilation ducts mapped by a simple janitor. "Need to check the electrical room," James muttered, his shuffling path taking him past the Yakuza's new muscle. Their dismissive glances missed how he measured their height, weight, reaction times. Data that would prove vital for what was coming. The electrical room had been James's first modification to the mall 5 years ago. Behind mundane circuit breakers, a false panel concealed his observation post. Maps marked with patrol patterns, photographs identifying gang members and their habits, notes on tactical vulnerabilities, all recorded with sniper's precision. A new set of photographs joined his intelligence wall. The Israeli contractors changed everything. They'd bring tactical experience, proper security protocols, maybe even counter-sniper training, just like the NVA's Russian advisors had done in a Shao Valley. But James had adapted then, and he would adapt now. His radio crackled. "Walker, cleanup needed at the food court." Mark's voice carried the new danger code. More Yakuza arriving, probably to conduct a protection payment collection round. James acknowledged with his usual tired sigh, but his mind was already calculating. Food court offered multiple angles, civilian presence requiring precise shot selection. Just like Hugh City, where every trigger pull had to account for collateral damage. Through his chosen route, James noted more signs of the gang's expanding control. The bakery's windows now displayed Yakuza-owned product lines. The electronics store's inventory had been purchased at a fraction of its value. The shoe shop's owner wore bruises poorly concealed by makeup. Sarah Chin's father watched from his store's broken window as James passed. Their eyes met briefly, the old shop owner's fear matching expressions James remembered from Vietnamese villagers. But beneath that fear, James saw something familiar, the same stubborn resistance that had made simple farmers stand against overwhelming force. The food court's morning crowd provided excellent cover as James positioned his cleaning cart. Each movement maintained his elderly janitor facade while establishing optimal observation points. The Yakuza's new muscle had established a professional security perimeter, but they were focused outward. They hadn't learned yet that the greatest threat was already inside their defenses. James's worn boots scraped across tile floors, marking precise distances. Like ranging targets in jungle valleys, every measurement committed to memory. The Israeli contractors had brought professional expertise to the Yakuza's operation. But James had learned long ago that expertise meant nothing without proper intelligence. And right now, they had no idea they were being hunted by one of the Marine Corps' most lethal snipers. As morning light filled Sunset Mall's corridors, James Walker continued his methodical cleaning routine. But behind his carefully maintained mask of elderly weakness, other calculations continued. Range estimation, wind correction, point of aim adjustment for elevation. The same variables that had once helped him eliminate high-value targets in Vietnam's deadliest combat zones. The Yakuza were escalating their pressure on the mall's merchants. But they were about to learn what the NVA had discovered in a Shao Valley, that sometimes the most dangerous predator was the one hiding in plain sight, patiently waiting for the perfect shot. The first signs of dawn were breaking over Sunset Mall when 5 Yakuza members cornered James in the empty east parking structure. Their expensive shoes echoed off concrete walls as they surrounded the old janitor, who was seemingly caught checking the building's maintenance access. James noted their positions with sniper's precision, 2 behind, 2 flanking, leader front and center. Standard intimidation formation, but poorly executed. They'd left 3 separate escape routes and failed to account for the structure's support pillars. Maintenance man, their leader, Koji, sneered in accented English. "We've been watching you. Always cleaning, always watching. Always where you're not wanted." He adjusted his designer suit, dragon tattoos visible beneath silk sleeves. The other 4 spread wider, trying to look menacing. James maintained his elderly janitor pose, hands shaking slightly as he gripped his cleaning cart. "Just doing my job," he mumbled, deliberately slurring his words like a frightened old man. But his pale eyes mapped distances, angles, potential weapon locations. The nearest Yakuza stood 1.8 meters away, point-blank range for someone trained in close combat at Quantico. "Your job." Koji stepped closer, exactly as James had predicted. Arrogant predators always move closer to frighten prey. "Your job is to clean floors, old man. Not to interfere with business. Not to warn shop owners when we're coming. Not to accidentally block our collections with your stupid cart." James hunched lower, the perfect picture of elderly submission. But beneath that careful facade, combat-honed muscles coiled with familiar tension. Like setting up a sniper's hide, Every movement was calculated for maximum effect. Sarah Chin, Koji continued, pulling on leather gloves. Sweet girl. Pregnant, I hear. Would be shame if something happened to her nice jewelry shop. All that broken glass. He smiled, expecting the threat to break the old man's spirit. Instead, something changed in the air. Later, the Yakuza would struggle to explain exactly what happened. How the stooped janitor seemed to grow taller, his presence expanding to fill the concrete space. How those pale eyes suddenly held the same cold calculation they'd seen in their most hardened killers. 847 meters, James said quietly, his voice carrying the same precision he'd once used calling wind adjustments in Vietnam. That was my longest confirmed kill. NVA Colonel. Through jungle canopy in monsoon conditions. They said the shot was impossible. The Yakuza members exchanged confused glances, their intimidation routine disrupted by this unexpected response. Koji's smile faltered as James continued, his voice carrying memories of jungle warfare and urban combat. 212 confirmed kills in Vietnam. 11 more in classified operations that don't officially exist. Marine Scout Sniper, top of my class. James's hand stopped shaking, now rock steady as he gestured to the distant city skyline. From this position, I can reach 8 different sniper hides with clear lines of sight to your favorite restaurants, your homes, your mistress's apartments. The 2 Yakuza behind him moved forward, but froze as James's next words cut through the morning air. The one in the blue suit just reached for a Glock 19. Poor choice for concealed carry, slides too easily on silk. The one by the pillar has a knife in his boot, but his stance is wrong for quick deployment. Koji's face hardened, professional assessment replacing casual arrogance. You threaten us, old man. Do you know who we are? Yakuza, James replied calmly. Specifically, the Shimatakai faction. Mid-level soldiers trying to expand territory through intimidation of soft targets. Poor tactical choices, sloppy surveillance, overconfidence in urban operations. He turned slightly, positioning himself relative to the support pillars. In Vietnam, we call that target-rich environment. The morning sun cast long shadows through the parking structure as James delivered his final warning. Sarah Chin and every other shop owner in this mall is under my protection. The next time your men enter Sunset Mall with threatening intentions, I won't be a janitor having a conversation. I'll be a sniper sending a message. You're one old man, Koji snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. We are many. In a Shao Valley, I held off an NVA battalion for 3 days. Alone. They never saw me. Never knew where the shots came from. Just found their officers dead every time they tried to advance. James's voice carried absolute conviction. I spent 5 years memorizing every angle, every line of sight, every access point in this mall. Like that sniper hide, I've already prepared 6 levels up with clear view of where your lieutenant parks his Mercedes. The Yakuza members shifted uneasily as James named the exact spot where their second-in-command kept his prized car. The old janitor hadn't been just cleaning all these years. He'd been gathering intelligence, preparing positions, learning patterns. This is your only warning, James said quietly. The next message won't be delivered with words. He turned his back on them, the ultimate insult to men who lived by intimidation, and began pushing his cleaning cart toward the exit. The Yakuza watched him go, their carefully constructed image of a harmless old janitor shattered by glimpses of the predator beneath. He's bluffing, one of the younger men muttered. Has to be. But Koji wasn't so sure. He'd seen that same cold calculation in the eyes of other veterans, men who'd learned their trade in jungles and urban warfare. Men who didn't make threats or they gave warnings. As James disappeared into the early morning light, the Yakuza members tried to convince themselves they still held the advantage. But deep down, They felt the same dark certainty that had gripped NVA patrols in Vietnam. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were being hunted. Dawn painted Sunset Mall's glass, ceiling in shades of gold as James Walker made his final security rounds. His mop moved in practiced patterns, but his mind was calculating firing solutions. The food court's upper level offered a clear shot to all main entrances, 127 meters to the east entrance, 143 to the west, perfect overlapping fields of fire. Just like setting up interlocking kill zones in Hughes City. In his maintenance cart, beneath cleaning supplies arranged with military precision, lay the tools of his other trade. Range fighter disguised as a broken light meter, wind gauge hidden in a tobacco tin, spotting scope nested in old plumbing parts. Every item had its place, every tool maintained as meticulously as he'd once maintained his M40A1. "Morning, Mr. Walker," Mark Reynolds approached, his security uniform crisp despite the early hour. Their conversation appeared casual, two employees discussing routine maintenance, but their words carried deeper meaning. "Third floor looks clear," James reported quietly, meaning the Yakuza surveillance team had finally left their observation post. "Light fixture needs replacing in Section 4. Translation, he'd identified the perfect sniper nest overlooking their meeting point. Mark nodded, understanding the code they developed. "Got some new cameras installed yesterday." His tone conveyed the real message. Police had finally placed undercover officers in the mall. Too little, too late in James's assessment. The Yakuza were moving too fast now. In his mind's eye, James overlaid the mall's layout with urban combat zones he'd known in Vietnam. The service corridors could become infiltration routes. Maintenance access points offered concealed firing positions. The ventilation system could carry sound or smoke in predictable patterns. Every aspect of the mall's architecture could be turned to tactical advantage. His phone vibrated, a message from Danny Rodriguez, his old spotter from Vietnam. They hadn't worked together since the Shao Valley, but some bonds never broke. "Got your package, Ghost. Hardware's clean, untraceable. Old buddy in Portland asking no questions." James allowed himself a grim smile. The rifle would arrive tomorrow, broken down into innocent-looking parts, shipped through a network of veterans who remembered what they owed the legendary Ghost of Scout Sniper Division. The Yakuza might have modern weapons, but they'd never faced a Marine sniper with a custom-built rifle zeroed for urban combat. "Mr. Walker." Sarah Chen's voice pulled him from tactical calculations. Her jewelry kiosk was opening late these days, fear making her cautious. "I found this behind my counter." She handed him a small origami crane, made from black paper. Her hands trembled. James took the crane carefully, recognizing the Yakuza warning sign. They were marking targets for tonight's protection visits. His jaw tightened as he remembered finding similar markers in Vietnamese villages, signs left by NVA death squads before night raids. "Don't worry about closing up tonight," he told Sarah gently. "I'll be working late. Lots of maintenance to catch up on." What he didn't say was that he'd already prepared 3 separate firing positions covering her kiosk. No more villagers would die while he watched. Not in his territory. Through the mall's windows, he spotted 2 Yakuza soldiers doing their morning reconnaissance. Their pattern was predictable, same route, same timing, same arrogant assumption that no one noticed them. In Vietnam, predictability got you killed. These men hadn't learned that lesson yet. James pushed his cleaning cart toward the service elevator, each movement measured and deliberate. The cart's false bottom now concealed more than maintenance tools. Brass casings nestled in cleaning rags, hand-loaded ammunition crafted to his exact specifications. Just like the old days when every shot had to be perfect. His radio crackled, the coded signal for Mark that meant Yakuza leadership had arrived at their usual coffee shop meeting. James positioned himself near the planters, apparently trimming dead leaves while actually recording their conversation through the directional microphone disguised as a pruning tool. Their words confirmed his worst fears. Tonight would be their first major, simultaneous visits to multiple shops, escalating from threats to violence. They planned to make examples of any resistance. Sarah's kiosk was on their list. James felt the familiar calm settling over him, the sniper's peace that came with absolute certainty. His hands, which shook convincingly while mopping floors, were steady as stone as he mentally rehearsed each shot. Range, elevation, wind calls, all the variables locked into muscle memory through thousands of rounds downrange. In his apartment that evening, James laid out his tools with ritualistic precision. Distance cards calculated for every major intersection in the mall. Wind formulas adjusted for air conditioning currents. Detailed maps marking every security camera, every escape route, every potential crisis point. The rifle parts arrived in separate packages, scope hidden in plumbing supplies, barrel disguised as maintenance equipment, stock broken down to look like repair tools. As he assembled the weapon, each piece clicking into place with familiar certainty, James Walker felt the last vestiges of his janitor persona falling away. The Yakuza thought they were preparing to take territory through fear and violence. They didn't realize they'd wandered into a carefully prepared kill zone, watched over by a sniper who'd learned his trade in the hardest school imaginable. Tonight, they would learn what the NVA had learned in Ashao Valley, that the most dangerous predator was the one you never saw coming. As darkness fell over Sunset Mall, James Walker checked his equipment one final time. The old shooting journal lay open beside him, its pages filled with calculations and confirmations from another war. Tonight would add new entries. Different targets, different terrain, but the same absolute commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would prey on them. The ghost of Scout Sniper Division was about to remind the world why some legends never die. Black SUVs rolled into Sunset Mall's parking lot like a funeral procession, their tinted windows reflecting early morning light. From his position on the third-floor maintenance catwalk, James Walker watched through his spotting scope as 12 men in expensive suits emerged. Their formation spoke of military training, professional hitters brought in from Japan to deal with the mall problem. I count 3 with shoulder rigs, 2 carrying low back, rest probably ankle carry, James murmured into his radio. In the security office, Mark Reynolds watched through surveillance cameras, coordinating with a handful of guards James had personally vetted and trained over the past week. They're heading for Chen's jewelry first, Mark reported. Sarah's not due to open for another hour. James allowed himself a thin smile. The Yakuza were following predictable patterns, just like the NVA had done before learning the cost of routine. His spotting scope tracked their movement, cataloging each man's position in the formation. The leader, distinctive by his silver streak hair and scarred left ear, carried himself with the measured grace of someone trained in close combat. Our friend from Tokyo arrived early. A new voice crackled through the radio. Danny Rodriguez, still watching James's back after all these years, had positioned himself in an empty storefront with clear sight lines to the main entrance. The years hadn't slowed his ability to read tactical situations. Sato Takashi used to run wet work for the Yamaguchi-gumi family before going independent. James had expected this. After 3 of their extortion teams disappeared without trace last week, the Yakuza would bring in serious talent. His mind automatically calculated firing solutions from various positions while maintaining his outward appearance of a tired janitor starting his morning routine. Through his scope, he watched Sato's men systematically checking shops that had refused protection money. Their movements were precise, professional, but they still missed crucial details. None looked up to the maintenance catwalks. None noticed the subtle changes in security camera positions. None spotted the pressure plates James had installed at key intersections, feeding movement data to Mark's security station. They're setting up observation posts, Danny reported. Two-man teams at each major entrance. Professional coverage. James's radio crackled again. Sir, young Tommy Chen's voice shook slightly. The college kid working part-time security had shown promise in the crash course on tactical observation. Got 3 more vehicles entering from the south lot. Lower-level muscle looks like local talent. Establishing a perimeter, James confirmed. His scope tracked Sato directing his men with small hand gestures. They're expecting resistance, but looking for it at street level. A mistake James had seen before, in urban combat operations where the enemy forgot to account for vertical advantage. Sarah Chen arrived early, escorted by 2 of Mark's guards as planned. James had made sure she understood her role, business as usual. No sign that anything was different. Her hands shook slightly as she unlocked her kiosk, but she maintained composure as Sato's men approached. Protection costs have increased. Sato's English carried only a slight accent. Recent security issues require additional resources. His smile never reached his eyes as he quoted a figure that would bankrupt the small business within months. James watched Sarah's response through his scope. The young woman's spine straightened, her voice carrying clearly through the mall's morning quiet. I don't need protection. The mall's security is excellent. Sato's smile widened fractionally. Perhaps a demonstration of the risks? One of his men moved toward the jewelry displays, hand reaching inside his jacket. The red dot appeared on the man's chest, so briefly most would have missed it. But Sato's combat experience showed. He registered the targeting laser instantly, grabbing his subordinate's arm. James smiled. Message delivered. Check the upper levels, Sato barked in Japanese. James's scope caught the flash of recognition in the gang leader's eyes. This wasn't random resistance. This was professional opposition. 6 tangos moving to escalators, Danny reported calmly. For holding main floor, 2 with Sato at Chen's kiosk. James's mind calculated vectors and fields of fire, just as he had in countless urban combat situations. The mall's architecture created natural channeling points, forcing predictable movement patterns. He'd spent weeks preparing this battlefield, and the Yakuza were walking into positions he'd selected with sniper's precision. Mark, implement pattern Charlie, he commanded softly. Throughout the mall, subtle changes began. Maintenance doors quietly locked. Security gates partially lowered, restricting movement options. Lighting shifted slightly, creating disorienting shadows in key corridors. Getting calls from our watchers, Tommy reported. More vehicles approaching from the east. Looks like they're bringing in everything they've got. James allowed himself another thin smile. The Yakuza were responding exactly as predicted, committing more resources to what they saw as a straightforward security problem. They still hadn't grasped what they were really facing. Danny, prepare to initiate contact sequence. Mark, begin civilian evacuation protocol. Tommy, maintain perimeter observation. Each acknowledgement came instantly, his makeshift team functioning with military precision after just days of training. Through his scope, James watched Sato's growing frustration as his men reported no sign of the threat they'd glimpsed. The gang leader's tactical experience would be telling him something was wrong, but he couldn't identify the nature of the trap closing around him. Sir, Tommy's voice carried barely contained excitement. Got movement in the south lot. Multiple vehicles. But these aren't Yakuza. James didn't need to look. Right on schedule, the first of his old Marine Corps contacts were arriving. Men who'd fought beside him in Vietnam, who'd never forgotten what they owed the legendary Ghost. The Yakuza had brought in professional killers to solve their mall problem. They were about to learn the difference between hired guns and combat veterans who'd fought through hell together. Dawn painted Sunset Mall's glass dome in shades of crimson as James Walker made his final preparations. The early morning silence reminded him of other dawns, other missions, when the world held its breath before violence erupted. His janitor's cart sat loaded with more than cleaning supplies, each compartment carefully modified to hold specific equipment. Just like preparing a sniper's hide, every tool had its purpose, every position its backup. Through his earpiece, Mark Reynolds' voice carried quiet tension. Yakuza vehicles spotted leaving their compound. 12 men, heavily armed. They're done playing games, James. From his position in the mall's maintenance corridor, James checked his watch. 6:17 a.m. Early deliveries would be arriving soon. Sarah Chan would be setting up her kiosk, 7 months pregnant now, and still refusing to be intimidated into selling. Other shop owners would be arriving, people who trusted the quiet old janitor without knowing what he really was. All sectors locked down. James asked, his voice carrying the same calm that had steadied younger Marines during combat operations. Security teams in position. Police delayed by multiple incidents across the city. Mark's disgust was evident. They've planned this well. James moved silently through service corridors he'd memorized years ago. His tactical vest, concealed beneath the janitor's uniform, carried specialized equipment from his old footlocker. Not standard sniper gear. This was urban combat, requiring different tools, different strategies. Remember Hugh City, he muttered to himself, muscle memory from close-quarter combat training surfacing. The mall's architecture provided similar challenges, multiple levels, civilian presence, complex sight lines. But it also offered advantages to someone who knew how to use urban terrain. The first Yakuza team breached through the loading dock, their movements showing professional training. James watched through carefully positioned mirrors as they secured entry points with practiced efficiency. But they were looking for obvious threats, not an elderly janitor who knew every maintenance shaft and service corridor. Northwest entrance compromised, Mark reported. They're moving in tactical formation. These aren't street thugs, James. These are professionals. Good. James's voice carried deadly certainty. Professionals are predictable. Predictable is vulnerable. He'd spent weeks preparing for this, analyzing their patterns, calculating firing solutions for every major intersection in the mall. Just like plotting artillery grids in Vietnam, but with civilians to consider. Each position had been selected to minimize collateral damage while maximizing tactical advantage. The Yakuza's main force entered through the east entrance, led by their commander in his expensive suit. James recognized him from intelligence photos. Tanaka, former Japanese Special Forces, now Yakuza enforcer. His tactical deployment showed military training, spreading his men to cover approaches professional security would use. But James wasn't professional security. He was a ghost, moving through maintenance shafts and ventilation ducts mapped during countless night shifts. The first shot, when it came, seemed to materialize from nowhere. The .308 round, fired through a specially modified air vent, struck Tanaka's radio with surgical precision. The commander's communications died instantly, cutting him off from his tactical teams. The shot's echo, bounced off carefully calculated surfaces, made it impossible to locate the source. Contact East in trance. One of Tanaka's men shouted in Japanese, spinning to face the wrong direction. James was already moving, using old urban warfare tactics learned in Vietnamese cities. Sound could be weaponized, turned against those who didn't understand its properties in enclosed spaces. The second shot disabled the lead team's breaching equipment without causing casualties. Precise shooting, just like the old days, but with different objectives. He wasn't hunting NVA officers now. He was protecting his people, his territory. They're splitting up, Mark reported, watching through security feeds. 2-man teams, trying to isolate the threat. Exactly as James had predicted. Professional soldiers, faced with an unseen sniper, would divide to minimize casualties while maximizing search coverage. But dividing their forces was exactly what he'd planned for. Each team found themselves encountering mysterious malfunctions. Communications failed, weapons jammed, equipment shorted out, all caused by precisely placed shots from positions that seemed impossible. The ghost of a Shao Valley was teaching a new generation about fear. James, Mark's voice carried urgency. Sarah's arriving early. She didn't get the warning. Through his scope, James spotted her entering through the north doors, unaware of the danger. Two Yakuza operators were already moving to intercept. Time slowed as combat instincts took over, decades of experience distilling into pure action. The first shot struck the lighting panel above the Yakuza team, showering them with sparks and forcing them to dive for cover. The second shot disabled the emergency exit, blocking their planned escape route. Each round placed with surgical precision, creating chaos without casualties. Sarah's clear, Mark confirmed. Security has her in the safe room. But James, Tanaka's figured it out. He's called in his heavy weapons. James allowed himself a grim smile as he moved to his next prepared position. He'd counted on Tanaka's pride, his need to save face after being outmaneuvered. Professional soldiers were predictable. When pressed, they escalated force rather than risking embarrassment. "Time to remind them why they call me Ghost," James whispered, settling into his final firing position. The same words he'd spoken in a Shao Valley, before changing the course of an entire offensive with one impossible shot. The mall's corridors echoed with confusion as the Yakuza's professional operation dissolved into chaos. They'd come expecting to find security guards and civilian resistance. Instead, they'd walked into the killing ground of a legend who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Dawn fully broke over Sunset Mall as James Walker began his final movement. The Yakuza were about to learn what the NVA had discovered in Vietnam, that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one you never saw coming, the one who turned your own professional training against you. Ghost was hunting again, and his territory would be protected. Sunset Mall's evening lights cast long shadows across empty corridors as James Walker made his final preparations. The Yakuza had chosen Sunday night for their show of force, planning to make examples of resistant shop owners. They hadn't realized they were walking into a carefully orchestrated kill zone. From his position in the maintenance access tunnel above the food court, James checked his rifle one last time. The familiar weight of the M40A1 brought memories of other battles, other times when precision meant survival. He'd retrieved it from a hidden cache that morning, along with specialized ammunition he'd maintained for decades. Just in case. "Ghost, they're moving," Mark's voice whispered through the encrypted radio. 3 SUVs just pulled into the east lot, counting 15 targets. Heavy weapons. James's pale eyes studied the scene through carefully prepared observation ports. His mind automatically calculated ranges, angles, wind variables from the mall's ventilation system. Each position had been measured precisely during years of quiet preparation. Every shot was already planned. "Sarah and the others?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. Mark Reynolds was nothing if not thorough. "Secure in the basement level. Police are staged 5 blocks out, waiting for your signal." Mark paused. "Are you sure about this, Ghost? These aren't village guerrillas. These are professional killers." James allowed himself a small smile. The Yakuza were indeed professionals, feared throughout the Pacific Rim. But they hadn't spent 2 years in the jungle, learning to kill from distances other snipers called impossible. They hadn't carried a wounded spotter through enemy territory for 12 days straight. They weren't Ghost. The first Yakuza members entered through the east doors, moving with practiced coordination. Their leader, Tanaka, strode confidently in his $1,000 suit. James recognized the tactical formation, 3-man teams, well-armed, maintaining professional spacing. In another time, he might have admired their discipline. "Remember your promises," James spoke quietly into the radio. "No matter what happens, the shop owners never learn about this. Let them keep believing in mall security and police response." "Understood," Mark replied. Good hunting, Ghost. The Yakuza reached the central courtyard, spreading out to secure the area. Their movements showed military training. These weren't street thugs, but experienced killers. James watched through his scope as Tanaka began issuing orders, directing teams towards specific stores marked for lessons. Time stretched like jungle rubber as James settled into his shooting rhythm. Breathe in. Acquire target. Calculate drop. Adjust for ventilation currents. Breathe out. Squeeze. The first shot shattered the mall's silence. Before Tanaka's body hit the polished floor, James was already shifting to his next target. The Yakuza's professional discipline worked against them. Their training told them to seek cover, to identify the threat's direction. But James had chosen his position carefully. There was no cover from above. Second shot. Third. Each round finding its mark with surgical precision. The Yakuza's return fire echoed harmlessly off empty walls, their bullets hitting nothing but air. James moved between pre-prepared positions, never firing twice from the same spot. Just like in the jungle, movement meant survival. East team is breaking, Mark reported tensely. They're trying to retreat to the vehicles. James had anticipated this. His next shot took out their tactical leader, creating confusion in the retreat. The Yakuza's training emphasized unit cohesion, removed command elements, and the structure began to crack. Through his scope, he watched fear replace professional confidence. The Yakuza had come expecting to intimidate shopkeepers, to demonstrate their power over civilians. Instead, they were being systematically eliminated by an unseen enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. Police moving in, Mark's voice carried satisfaction. Barricading all exits. A burst of automatic fire sprayed wildly toward the ceiling. James didn't flinch. Panic shooting, wasting ammunition. In the jungle, he'd learned to read desperation in an enemy's firing patterns. These men were no longer thinking tactically. They were simply trying to survive. Ghost. One of the Yakuza shouted in Japanese, his voice echoing off mall walls. The ghost of a Shao Valley. James's finger paused on the trigger. So they knew that name, even here. His reputation from Vietnam still carried weight in certain circles. Good. Fear could be a more effective weapon than bullets. The remaining Yakuza began surrendering, dropping weapons, raising hands. Professional pride gave way to survival instinct. James watched through his scope as police tactical teams moved in, securing prisoners with practiced efficiency. None of the officers looked toward the upper maintenance areas. They wouldn't find evidence of his position. That had been part of the plan from the beginning. Clear, Mark reported finally. 15 targets neutralized or captured. No civilian casualties. No collateral damage. James began breaking down his rifle with practiced precision, each movement automatic after countless repetitions. The weapon would return to its hidden cache, hopefully never needed again. The shell casings had already been collected, nothing left to tell the true story of tonight's events. Dawn would bring official reports of a failed Yakuza intimidation attempt, thwarted by coordinated police response. The shop owners would praise law enforcement efficiency, never knowing about the elderly janitor who protected them from above. Just as villagers in Vietnam had never known about the shadow that kept them safe from distant hillsides. Ghost, Mark spoke quietly. The department will want statements, reports. They'll get what they need, James replied, securing the last of his equipment. The official story will satisfy everyone. Through the observation port, he watched emergency lights painting the mall's corridors in red and blue. Tomorrow he'd return to his mop and bucket, to his careful facade of aged invisibility. The shop owners would greet him with the same casual kindness, never suspecting that their elderly janitor had just eliminated a major Yakuza operation with surgical precision. Sarah Chen would return to her kiosk, no longer trembling at sudden noises. Other shops would operate without fear of protection rackets or mysterious accidents. The mall would return to normal, its people never knowing how close they'd come to falling under Yakuza control. James Walker, known in another time as Ghost, allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he began his final checks, ensuring no trace remained of the deadly skills hidden beneath his janitor's uniform. The predator would return to his camouflage, invisible once more, but always watching, always ready. Morning light filtered through Sunset Mall's skylights, illuminating evidence markers where tactical teams had processed the scene. James Walker moved through his regular cleaning routine, each sweep of his mop precise and measured, just as it had been before. But now, the shopkeeper's eyes followed him with something beyond respect, a mix of awe and gratitude that made the old sniper uncomfortable. Detective Sarah Martinez stood near the food court, reviewing final reports. 12 Yakuza members in custody, she said as James approached, including 3 high-ranking lieutenants. Ballistics confirmed 5 precision shots from multiple positions, all non-lethal, all expertly placed. She paused, studying the elderly janitor. You know, in Vietnam, they called you the ghost of a Shao. James continued mopping, his movements maintaining the familiar rhythm that had become second nature. That was a long time ago, detective. Different war, different man. 412 confirmed kills, Martinez continued. Longest confirmed shot at 1,123 meters in adverse conditions. 3 silver stars, 2 purple hearts, and a Navy Cross that's still classified. She closed her notebook. But what interests me more is that last night, during a major tactical operation, not a single civilian was injured. No collateral damage. No stray rounds. Just precision shots that disabled without killing. Through the freshly cleaned windows, James watched Sarah Chen opening her jewelry kiosk. Her hands were steady now, her movements confident. The fear that had haunted the mall's merchants had been replaced by something else, a sense of security, a community protected. The paperwork will show the Yakuza were apprehended through coordinated law enforcement action, Martinez said quietly. Official reports won't mention a 67-year-old janitor who just happened to be a legendary Marine Scout sniper. But unofficially, she extended her hand. Thank you for protecting our city. James shook her hand briefly, then returned to his cleaning cart. Mark Reynolds approached, his security uniform pressed sharp for the morning news crews gathering outside. FBI's here, he reported. They're connecting last night's arrests to 3 major human trafficking operations. Looks like the Yakuza's entire West Coast network is unraveling. The mall's early morning quiet was broken by the arrival of first shoppers. James watched them move through their normal routines, unaware of the precision calculations and tactical planning that had gone into protecting their safety, just as he preferred it. Mr. Walker. Sarah Chen's voice carried none of its former fear as she approached. The Merchants Association is meeting this afternoon. We'd like you to attend. She glanced at the security office. Mark says you've been protecting us for years, long before the Yakuza came. We want to do something to show our appreciation. James's weathered hands gripped his mop handle, remembering other grips, other weapons, other battles. No need, he said softly. Just doing my job. But word was spreading. Throughout the morning, shopkeepers and regular customers stopped to thank him. Some brought coffee, others shared stories of times they'd noticed his quiet interventions over the years. The invisible janitor had become visible, his careful anonymity stripped away by the truth of his actions. By afternoon, news vans crowded the parking lot. Local hero thwarts gang takeover. Headlines competed with Vietnam legend protects community. James avoided the cameras, focusing on his routine. There were still floors to clean, trash to collect, simple duties that had become a different kind of mission over the years. In his office, Mark was coordinating with federal agencies. The tactical data James had gathered over months of observation was proving invaluable to ongoing investigations. "They're talking about a joint task force," Mark reported, "using your methods to protect other commercial districts. The brass wants to know if you consider consulting." James moved to the window, pale eyes scanning his territory with sniper's precision. Below, he could see Mr. Chen installing new displays in his wife's jewelry kiosk. The Korean restaurant was busy with lunch customers. Normal life returning, made possible by carefully placed shots from precisely chosen positions. "I've got a better idea," he said finally. Turning to Mark, he outlined a different plan. Not about tactics or operations, but about community. About teaching business owners to watch for patterns, to communicate suspicious activities, to work together. About transforming a shopping mall into a protected community. Detective Martinez returned late afternoon, carrying James's old shooting journal. "Found this in the sniper nest on the roof," she said. "Thought you might want it back." She paused. "The calculations in here. They're teaching this stuff at Quantico now. But reading your notes, seeing how you adapted military operations to civilian protection, that's something else entirely." James accepted the journal, its worn leather familiar in his hands. The final pages held new calculations, not for jungle warfare or urban combat, but for protecting a community. Range data, wind corrections, and tactical plots mixed with notes about shopkeeper schedules and security patrol patterns. As evening approached, James walked his usual cleaning route. Each shop he passed represented someone he'd sworn to protect. Not through official orders or military command, but through the simple choice to use his skills for something beyond war. The mall's lights dimmed, signaling closing time. James stored his cleaning supplies with military precision, each tool in its proper place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, federal inquiries, media attention, the complex task of maintaining security without sacrificing the community's peace. But for now, watching the last customers leave safely through freshly cleaned doors, James Walker felt a familiar satisfaction. Different from the cold calculation of combat kills, this was the quiet pride of a guardian who had found a new way to serve. The ghost of a Shao Valley had become something else, a silent protector, using skills forged in war to preserve peace in the most unexpected of places. 6 months after the Yakuza's final retreat from Sunset Mall, James Walker still maintained his precise cleaning patterns, his mop moving in measured 36-inch strokes across polished floors. But things had changed. The way shop owners nodded to him now carried newfound respect. Security guards stood straighter when he passed, understanding at last what true vigilance meant. Sarah Chen's jewelry kiosk had expanded into a proper store. Her infant daughter slept peacefully in a carrier, while Sarah arranged displays without the slightest tremor in her hands. The sight brought a subtle smile to James's weathered face. Some victories weren't measured in confirmed kills or combat effectiveness. Sometimes they were measured in the simple absence of fear. Latest security upgrades are in place, Mark Reynolds reported quietly as James cleaned near the mall's newly reinforced east entrance. The head of security had transformed over the past months, implementing protocols that went far beyond standard mall security measures. "That training program you designed for the new officers, it's changing everything." James nodded, maintaining his careful facade of elderly humility. The advanced urban security program he developed combined his Marine Scout sniper experience with practical civilian protection measures. Mall security now operated with tactical awareness that would have impressed his old Vietnam unit. Federal Task Force finally closed the Yakuza's regional headquarters, Mark continued, pretending to check his phone. "They're saying our incident was the turning point. Gave them everything they needed to unravel the whole network." In the food court, where the Yakuza had once swaggered with impunity, a group of veterans now met regularly for coffee. James had spotted the signs, the way they carried themselves, how they scanned entrances, their tactical positioning even while relaxing. Word had spread through the veteran community about Sunset Mall's transformation. His shooting journal, once hidden in that old footlocker, now had company. A new notebook contained different calculations, security patrol patterns, response times, evacuation routes. The same precision he'd once applied to long-range kills now served to protect life. The mall had become a model for urban security, though few knew the full story of how that transformation began. Mr. Walker, Tommy Chin, Sarah's 3-year-old nephew, waved enthusiastically from the candy store. The boy had no idea that the kindly old janitor, who sometimes gave him quarters, had once been one of the most lethal snipers in Marine Corps history. That was fine with James. Some legends were better left in the shadows where they belonged. But the shadows still held secrets. James's enhanced security protocols had attracted attention from other malls, other communities facing similar threats. His methods, carefully sanitized to their military origins, were being studied and implemented across the country. The Yakuza's humiliating defeat had sent ripples through criminal organizations nationwide. Police response times are down to 3 minutes, Mark noted with satisfaction. Having a direct line to Major Cooper helps. The police major had been skeptical at first, until James had demonstrated just how vulnerable standard law enforcement protocols were to organized crime. Now Sunset Mall served as a training ground for joint civilian-police security operations. James's apartment above Harry's Hardware still offered clear lines of sight to those 3 major intersections. But now other veterans had taken up residence nearby, creating an informal network of trained observers. They never spoke of it directly, but James recognized their positioning, their routines. Old habits serving new purposes. His range kit, though unused since Vietnam, remained perfectly maintained behind that hidden panel. He hadn't needed it during the Yakuza incident. Hadn't needed to prove that his skills as Ghost remained lethal even after decades of disuse. The threat of capability had proved more effective than its application. The Chinese restaurant's owner, Mr. Liu, waved as James passed. The subtle nod they exchanged acknowledged more than mere greeting. The business owners had formed their own network, coordinating security information through seemingly casual conversations. James had taught them, well, the best defense systems were the ones potential threats never recognized. Got some interest from Homeland Security, Mark mentioned casually. They're studying our community-integrated security protocols. Want to implement similar systems in other high-risk urban areas. James allowed himself another slight smile. His methods were being adapted far beyond Sunset Mall's gleaming corridors. The same principles that had once helped him survive in Vietnam's jungles now protected shopping centers, helped communities resist organized crime, gave people back their sense of security. As evening approached, James watched families shopping without fear, store owners closing without anxiety, security guards patrolling with real purpose. The mall had become more than just his post-Vietnam sanctuary. It had become a prototype, proving that the right combination of experience, training, and community engagement could transform vulnerable spaces into hardened targets. His radio crackled, a spill in the North Corridor needed cleaning. James moved with practiced efficiency, his apparent shuffle masking the same smooth precision that had once earned him combat honors. The mask of the humble janitor remained firmly in place, but now concealed something more complex than just a former sniper. The Yakuza had wanted to own Sunset Mall. Instead, they'd helped create something unprecedented, a template for community defense that combined military expertise with civilian protection. As James Walker methodically cleaned the mall's floors that evening, he knew his greatest victory wasn't in the lives he'd taken as a sniper, but in the lives he now helped protect. The legend of Ghost remained in Vietnam's jungles. But here, in a suburban mall's polished corridors, James Walker had created a different kind of legacy. One measured not in confirmed kills, but in restored peace. Not in combat effectiveness, but in community strength. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that seemed invisible, just like the most effective guardians were the ones that remained unseen.